flipping the table.
This is Michael, and it's Season 2 of Flipping the Table. This is a podcast featuring honest conversations about food, farming, and the future. I do this because I'm inspired by all the people you will hear. Some of them I've known for decades, and others I've just met. But each of them are creating the knowledge, the food enterprises, farms, and ranches that will make for a future that works better for us all. Today's conversation is a bit different from those I've shared in the past because my guest is not focused on food systems. She's not a maker or a farmer. Rather, she is an author and a correspondent focused on science. And science, I believe, is the methodology that will prove that regenerative or agroecological agriculture is superior to the 20th century extractive and toxic chemical dependent conventional agriculture. But science, that is, belief or trust in science, has been steadily eroded by the rise of corporate power. This erosion of science as an arbiter of societal dilemmas or debates is what moved me to invite Dr. Britt Wray to have this conversation. Britt Wray was co-host of the BBC podcast Tomorrow's World, and has been guest host of Canada's legendary national TV show, The Nature of Things. I learned about Britt when The New Yorker named her first book, Rise of the Necrofauna, The Science, Ethics, and Risks of De-Extinction, one of the books they loved in 2017, and the Sunday Times called it a must-read. Britt has produced several radio documentaries for American, British, and Canadian media outlets. She created the award-winning interactive audio diary platform Auditor, which can be found at auditor.org. That is AURATOR.org. Its goal is to facilitate public dialogue about a controversial subject, synthetic biology. And Britt has a PhD in science communication with a focus on synthetic biology from the University of Copenhagen and holds a BS with honors in biology from Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and an interdisciplinary master's in art, media, and design from the Ontario College of Art and Design in Toronto. She's also been a visiting scholar at the NYU Arthur L. Carter Institute for Journalism and, in 2019, was a TED resident. It took me a bit of time to get to it, but I read Rise of the Necrofauna in early 2019, and it moved me. I find Britt's work stimulating because she often poses as many questions as she answers. She invites us to think about the implications of science and technological advances and how these changes will impact the world. She's honest and exposes her own thought process and conclusions and the emergent questions that rise from her explorations. Our plan today is to hear about her journey to science, to speak about her first book, Rise of the Necrofauna, the state of science, and the challenge of maintaining public trust in it. We'll end our conversation by turning to her next book on the psychological impacts of climate change. Welcome. Glad to have you here, Britt.
Hey, Michael, thank you for having me.
Very excited to do this conversation, and I'll often like to start with people describing how they came to the world that they work on. So how did you come to science?
So I studied it in my undergrad, which was just because I was inspired by my high school biology teacher and decided to continue with 4 more years of biology. But while I was doing that, I was in the lab a lot, and I felt It was an incredibly sterile environment that didn't wake me up and make me feel most alive. And what did instead were nature documentaries that I used to watch almost obsessively, usually narrated and produced by the BBC's David Attenborough.
Mm-hmm. I remember those.
Yes. And it was during those years that I realized, okay, maybe I don't need to be a scientist, but I can be a science storyteller. And I had a radio show at a campus community radio station, a trip hop show at the time, actually. And I...
Trip hop.
Yeah, wow. Just an old musical genre that I liked. And I decided, hey, what if I asked the people at the radio station if I can stop my music show and turn it into a science radio show and run around campus interviewing researchers and cutting that into narrative documentaries about science. And they went for it. So it started as a volunteer-based passion. And eventually I cut my teeth on cutting documentaries enough that I could pitch to professional broadcasters, CBC, BBC, NPR, places like that. And so that was now... over 12 years ago or so.
Wow.
And since then, I just followed the world of broadcasting into television and interactive documentary and eventually writing pop science books and doing the PhD in science communication.
Which I found fascinating. The fact that you did the master's in design and media, I thought was really cool. But the other thing that was really interesting to me is that you picked science communication, because I would say one of the big challenges is that science is not well understood because it's not well communicated. Right. I have noticed in recent years, particularly at UC Davis, the scientists are getting better because they're getting trained. But science communication is it's more important than ever, I think, now. We don't have an Einstein. One Einstein was kind of explaining everything for a long time, but we don't have that kind of person anymore.
No.
So it's a really big challenge. That's one of the things that impressed me about the book, because I could see your communication abilities explaining something rather complex and controversial in many ways, but doing it in a great way.
Oh, so. I appreciate that.
So, synthetic biology, really interesting topic. How did you land on that when you were doing your PhD?
Oh, well, that started way before, actually. There were some years that I was in Montreal.
And actually, I want you to define it for people, because some people may not know.
Absolutely, sure. So synthetic biology is essentially the approach of engineering life like a real engineering discipline. So thinking about the way you might build a bridge or a computer system, you want to work with abstracted forms of materials that are modular, that can fit together. Let's say you're on the other side of the globe and you've got a screw and I've got the nut. We know that they're going to fit together no matter where we are because they've been standardized with real engineering. So the ambition of synthetic biologists is to be able to do that with biology, with genes, with DNA, with constructs of living organisms that we will then be able to robustly build into systems that do things that we want them to. So create new foods, fuels, ingredients that are of high value, to replace things that are becoming scarcer. Rubber, for example, by having a synthetic form, essentially turning the cell into a factory, which brings with it many social and ethical questions, of course, right? So I was drawn to this because when I was in Montreal, I audited a bioart class at a university there. And this is where artists and designers actually get their hands wet with biotechnological tools. So they're using tissue culture engineering, for example, not to grow new organs, but to grow semi-living sculptures. And I was fascinated by the fact that this was going on. And it was in that class that I learned about an artist and designer named Alexandra Daisy Ginsburg, who is really focused on questions of what designers can do to create the questions that synthetic biologists are asking in the lab when they're talking about designing life.
Wow.
Because they have a really limited way of thinking about design if it's just hardcore engineering. What about the phenomenological and aesthetic qualities that designers who bring, that kind of flair into the products that we use, or if they're artists, the art that we're enjoying, what if you bring those kinds of questions into the lab? And she created some collaborations that really inspired me around this new way of looking at synthetic biology. And one thing led to the next, and I started studying it myself.
Wow. Fascinating. And I appreciate the fact that you brought up the social questions that arise from that, because it's huge. They are huge, and in your book you really get to that. And that's so. Why don't we talk about the rise of the necrofauna? Because first of all, Very interesting topic. Not that many people are probably aware of the amount of work going on. So why don't you just describe for people the book, what the book is about, and then we'll get into how the book ends, because that's what really thrilled me.
Sure. So the book is about a curious group of scientists who are trying to bring extinct species back to life in a fledgling field called de-extinction. So there are a scattering of scientific teams around the world that are attempting to use various biotechnological tools like cloning or gene editing, and even more basic fundamental methods that we've been using for a long time, like artificial selection, to create animals that are very, very, very close proxies of extinct species. So we're talking the woolly mammoth, the passenger pigeon, the aurochs, the heath hen.
The aurochs is the original cow, basically.
That's right. Yeah. The extinct ancestor of all of today's living cattle.
Right.
There's about 10 candidate species that are being worked on in different labs with different methods. And this idea at first sounds like science fiction. You can't have a conversation about de-extinction without someone bringing up Jurassic Park within the first 30 seconds. You know, the point being, did you not read the book or watch the film and see how that all went wrong? What are you thinking? Why would you bring these species back? A, can you? And B, where would they go? And C, are you going to perhaps try to profit off them in some way, the ways that we saw with Jurassic Park, things went awry. You know, are we going to be hubristic here and not humble in the face of our scientific powers? And so those were the kinds of questions that really fascinated me when I caught wind of the fact that some powerful scientists were indeed looking at doing things like genetically editing Asian elephants so that they become woolly mammoth-like, and then trying to get them back into the woolly mammoth's former range in Siberia.
And I would say the probably the maximum, the largest segment of the book is the stories of these different scientists doing their work. I mean, you visit with them, you go to their labs, and the places where they're working, and you have really interesting conversations about the major questions that you just touched upon. You know, like, where are they going to live, and is the environment right for them today?
Yeah.
But the book moves in the last chapter in kind of a synthesis, it seems to me, where you get to this question of how do we avoid the hubris? How do we avoid creating a situation where you maybe bring a species back and then it can't survive? And you end up going to scientists who are more critical of the idea, but then you end up going to a philosopher. Which I thought was fascinating. First, you went to Gregory Kebnick, I think was his name.
Yeah.
Who said that this technology, this attempt, puts human values at stake. I thought that was an interesting, because then that got you onto this line of questioning. In that last chapter, there are 9 compelling questions that you leave the reader with, and I don't know. And you end up with Thomas Van Doren, I guess, is the philosopher, and that is a fascinating conversation you have with him. Maybe you could tell our listeners what that whole section where you ended up going.
Sure. So Thomas Van Doren is a philosopher of extinction, if you can believe it. That exists.
It gives me the chills, actually. Yeah.
He's an incredibly deep thinker, very sensitive thinker. And he has been doing things like studying the last snail in a snail ark in Hawaii.
That's an incredible description you have in there.
Yes. And he's really opened up our ideas around what it means to be extinct in a way that we don't generally wrestle with when we have our conversations about being in the 6th mass extinction now, because we might assume that a species is not extinct if there are a few individuals left, right? It's still here somehow, but is it not completely functionally extinct? Is it not removed from its environment? Is it not in some kind of receptacle or cage where it's being monitored, no longer living out its ecosystem role? So in that sense, we see that extinction is actually a ripple effect. You know, it's a spectrum upon which we have different forms of valences of being extinct. You know, are they reproducing themselves in the ecosystem? Are they playing out their role? Are they functionally extinct in the wild and now they're just in captivity? If they're in captivity,
like that one snail, he talks about the one snail
haunting.
left. Yeah,
exactly.
It's sad.
It is.
Yeah,
it is. Which raises different questions about our relationship to these species. But he talks a lot about the need to mourn and to pay attention to extinction and to really listen to the pain and the grievance that comes from reckoning with the fact that the species is gone, never to be replicated again, because as a side note, de-extinction is not possible. You can never get the carbon copy of the original back because of the technical ways that they're reconstituted. You can get close, but it's never exactly the same. You're always creating something new. And so he warns us that if we are to rush to overcome extinction by just rallying together and trying to bring them back with our fancy technologies, we miss out on a huge opportunity to learn from the disappearance of that species, because mourning is the cost of attachment. When we are attached to things in the world that we love, that are valuable, and when those relationships disintegrate and break down, we grieve, we feel the pain, and that grieving is a process that allows us to now relearn the world in the absence of that species.
And that was the key for me, because it was how you get the humility back to actually make the right decisions about the future.
Right.
You have to be grounded in that valuation of the miraculous evolutionary story that brought us to this point.
Yeah.
It's incredible what emerged over billions of years. And for us to be nonchalant, in a sense, by thinking we have a technological fix is dangerous.
Yeah.
Because I would disagree, people would disagree this probably, but I would call it a soullessness. If you don't have, and I don't mean in a religious sense, I mean in a connective sense, a connection, a rootedness in something deeper, and it brings the humility. So that's that. When I read that, I was like, I got to talk to this woman. I mean, whoever wrote this is on to what's missing in so many ways in our world.
Yeah, I think it's a beautiful example that gets to our larger planetary crisis, which is that by rushing with a techno fix, we're just repeating this dominance model. We're the ones with the answers. We're at the center. We can fix this. Sure, we extracted and we've created this hole, but now we can fill it in with something impressive. And it's evading what really needs to happen, which is cultivating a partnership model with species that are non-human, and getting us out of the center and realizing that web of life needs to be respected in a lateral sense rather than this vertical sense. And I think these difficult feelings are emerging for a reason, and it's our job to listen to them and learn from them.
And that's going to get us to your next book.
Right.
But before we go there, I want to point out this is the link to agriculture and food. Because for me, what the idea of an agroecological or regenerative is that lateral relationship you're talking about. It's an understanding of the web of life, because agriculture is an intervention in natural systems that has totally disrupted. I mean, the data shows, the scientists say, that the most disruptive activity on the planet for humans is agriculture. It's destroyed huge swaths of ecosystems.
Yeah.
And then our need for energy tied to that, fossil fuels, is those two things together. Agriculture and fossil fuels have really created the crisis we have today. They're the underlying causes. And what started me on this, I pulled all these books because I realized that there's this chain of books that led to your book for me. The Future Eaters by Tim Flannery, Australian, amazing book written in the 90s, I believe. It's about what happened in Australia with the megafauna and the implications for culture. And then this book, The Great Bay, is fascinating, written by a poet, Gary Snyder's friend, lives next door on the property next to Gary Snyder up in the Sierra, who writes about the next 15,000 years and what happens on this planet because of our inability to get to that lateral connection, that linkage, that integration with the web of life rather than intervening.
Yeah.
And we end up going back at the end of this book, it's obviously a novel, we end up going back to matriarchies where we're tribal and we're living as indigenous people did long ago. It's a really fascinating story, but there's not a legacy. What am I trying to say? There's kind of a beautiful manifestation of people realizing the depth of what has to happen, and it's happening in agriculture now. And that's what really caught my attention when I read your book, is that this is another understanding about how we have to get reconnected. And so let's talk about science, because this is really there are scientists who believe that science and technology is the answer. It's going to solve everything. There are silver bullets.
Right.
I don't believe that because there are implications. So let's talk about, we didn't really talk about what the implications are.
Right.
We just talked about the awareness of the implications. So tell me about your thinking about what the implications are for genetic engineering, synthetic biology. I mean, what do you worry about?
Well, I do worry about any assumption that a technofix will solve what we're dealing with, because it needs to start at the bottom, not at the Band-Aid, right? At the root of why we need to regenerate, high value products that we can no longer get from nature because we've despoiled it in that natural form. For example, we need to change our behaviors first and foremost. So I think that a lot of the rush to overcome with some kind of technological solution also does not recognize the agency in the world, in material, in what soil can do and what animals can do and what DNA can do. And that is a mistake as well, because we have seen mega engineering projects throughout time that come and, let's say deep sea oil drilling or whatever it might be, not respecting the agency of the world as it is, because it just puts humans on the one side of having agency. And I think that we keep getting rudely surprised by that.
Invention of plastics is a great example.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite philosophers, Andrew Pickering, writes about this really beautifully. He calls it the mangle in practice. So it's again in this partnership of understanding that there are different elements of aliveness that we have to respect and be humble in the face of. And unintended consequences are everywhere. So I generally take that approach, but I don't think it should shut down the technological development. I don't think that we should be fearful or Luddites in the face of what is possible, because when wielded with humility and respect and recognizing the integrity of all things, I think we really can help solve some genetic diseases that rob people of a fruitful life when we're using CRISPR now, for example.
Right.
There are ways in which this can be shepherded for flourishing, but it requires, a different culture around the technologies that I don't think we have.
Yeah. So I really appreciate that, because I've been, because I'm a person who's been about an alternative agricultural paradigm and been kind of a critic of mainstream agriculture, I have come up against a dilemma, because I'm like you, I believe in science. I think science is needed and we need to pursue the scientific discoveries, but we need the moral and ethical guidelines that we don't currently have.
Yeah.
So a lot of my colleagues are like totally against genetically modified organisms, but with the advent of CRISPR and the discussion with some scientists around this, I see the real value and potential.
Yeah.
If the ethical and mental guidelines are in place to really honor life and the impacts, being careful about the unintended consequences. And one of the things that's always bothered me is no one in my world complains about genetic engineering as it's used for diabetics,
right,
or other things, but they do kind of off the cuff just hate it for agriculture,
right.
So that is a problem, and so this is what I really want to get at. Like, how do we get to a place in culture as a science communicator? How do we get to a place in our culture where we can get enough agreement in the society to move forward on things?
I think it is well overdue that corporations understand that their role, first and foremost, now must be demonstrating their own trustworthiness and not trying to window dress what they're doing for the public to think it's socially acceptable and come on in, and these kind of disingenuous forms of doing public engagement where it's really not about listening. It's still about advertising and holding the hands of people and trying to welcome them into their vision. I think people need to take whatever economic hit is required to really sit there and say, we have been part of the problem. Let's try to create a way so that we are taking your interests into our business model, And
how would, I agree with you, what would that look like? What process would have to be put in place for that to happen? Because, so Monsanto got bought by Bayer Crop Science or Syngenta, I can't remember who bought it. And then they're trying to rebrand and trying to get people to believe in them now.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't think that's going to work.
Yeah.
Just rebranding.
No, rebranding does not work because it does not breed trustworthiness. One example, it's not like it's achieved anything yet, but I was at a conference last week where there was a representative, a C-suite executive from Suncor, I believe they're called, the oil sands. And they sat there and they said, we recognize, and we are here to talk about the fact that we are the problem. The oil sands are the problem.
Good.
And I want to listen. And it's like, oh, great. That's very refreshing. I have not heard that approach from, and they also it would help then if they also talked about the history of the fossil fuel industry, sowing doubt in the public about the danger of its products,
right.
And doing things to really say,
confuse
we
the
understand.
public.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, the same things happens for sugary beverages. The same thing is
sugar beverages, big tobacco.
Yeah.
We've got so many examples, but not treating people as though we're idiots.
Right.
Understanding that we know this history, sitting through it, and having honest conversations is just a basic agreement. And also reparations where they can be made to people who have been hurt. Necessary, right?
Right.
So these are parts of that culture that I think could help, but
that means business plans.
It does.
Business models change and business plans change because it will have impact on their bottom line.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean they won't be able to morph and profit in other ways or in new ways, but it's definitely going to have it. I mean, so the shareholders become the real problem here.
Yeah.
And the boards of directors. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Because I watched what happened with not Whole Foods. What's the biggest retailer in the world? Walmart. So a colleague of mine who actually lives in Healdsburg, we're going to go later today, he has worked with Walmart through the years, and they had one CEO who kind of took them too far, and then now they have a new CEO who's, there's challenges that with these CEOs having to try and move these companies towards the frame that you're describing, the openness.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tricky, but it is starting to happen. People are talking about the need to not have endless economic growth.
Yes.
That we need to reconstitute the model.
I just read a New Yorker piece about that this week.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is Michael. I just wanted to say how thrilled I am and excited that you're listening to Flipping the Table. These are the kinds of conversations I've wanted to share with people for a decade or more. So please like us, share with your friends, write a review, and subscribe.
Let's talk about government. With the role of government in a process like this, is there a role for government? I mean, I know they tried with GMOs, genetically modified organisms. They put together the National Institute of their National Academy of Science or something, did a big study and came out. Yeah, they're not dangerous. It didn't really work. I mean, do you think government can help be an arbiter for science, or is it already too corrupted?
It's really tough. So if you take, let's say, the CRISPR example, we're now intervening in the shared human genome, our distributed history, right? Right. Our evolution is something that we can now in a single generation tamper with, change the direction of, and then make heritable throughout all future humans if we choose. This is really, really tough to get ahead of from a governmental perspective because there is no global consortium for creating the laws around this thing. Everything is relegated back to the nation state and what their laws are around this. So people are very worried about China.
Well, that dude already did it to those kids.
Of course, yes. We've got the first CRISPR babies now, Lulu and Nana, out in the world. And China has tried to make up for
Didn't
the
they put that guy in
there.
jail or something? Or they definitely busted him, took his lab away.
He was on house arrest, and then he disappeared.
Wow.
So I'm not sure what the latest is there, but last I checked, weren't really sure where he went. Mm-hmm. But yeah, or if you're talking about Russia, if you're talking about, in Germany, it's completely illegal. You cannot talk about it's called germline editing when you make a change that could be then passed on through the generations because you've edited embryos, sperm, or eggs. So it's heritable. No one is, and it might, of course, be related to their history.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's very different than another national context in which it's allowed for certain medical reasons, like the UK, for example. And so if you're okay with talking about government just at the nation state, interesting, good, and fine, but you're still affecting what is a shared human common good, essentially, if you're talking about our genome. So these are interesting questions that I think there are no simple answers for, but the regulatory system is a patchwork thing. And generally, as we see with AI, as we see with any of these new emerging technologies that are turning lots of heads, the technological prowess advances before the regulatory system.
Which always happens,
Always
it seems.
happens.
It always happens. So that is one of the challenges of the human species, is that we are so gifted in a way with the brain that this happens. I mean, the nuclear weapon is a good example.
Yeah.
I mean, my hope is that what you referred to, the fact that corporate leaders, I think global climate change is having such an impact. I know in the agricultural community, everybody's starting to, farmers who were denying it 2 years ago now are not denying it. I mean, it's evident. And so the question is, are the corporations going to move fast enough and deep enough because the corporations dominate in the United States. In Germany, they don't. It sounds like the German state still has power. Corporations in Russia are unified with government in many countries of the world. They're trying to do it here. It's kind of already here. China, certainly corporations and government are unified. So, going back to this idea of mourning, I'm a person, and I take this really from watching people's lives. When people are in pain, they change. And maybe that's what it's going to take. I mean, the pain of what's emergent now with climate change, maybe that's what will get us to this place where we get humble again.
Right.
And have a different approach. What do you think of it?
Yeah, there are a lot of people, commentators, who have different ways of describing exactly this, that perhaps we just need to be made so uncomfortable, disastrously so. I mean, there's going to be a lot of bloodshed, right? It's horrific to think about the benefit coming from the pain that we're going to see and already are seeing. But maybe that is what it takes to relearn the world and become compassionate shepherds of it, stewards of this in the way that we perhaps once were, the ways that Indigenous people now are still, and find ways of flourishing and respecting life, because we see that it truly is untenable, and we are also getting pushed off the earth with the ways that we despoil it. So people like Joanna Macy, for example, speak about going from the great, now I'm forgetting her first turn, but essentially what we're in now, being the problematic world, into the great turning, where we turn towards partnership, we turn towards respect in the web of life that we've lost ourselves from. And I think that there's a lot, I mean, certainly personally in my life, the pain that I feel with eco-anxiety or grieving of species that are being lost forced me to really reckon with my values and try to align my lifestyle to them in a much more meaningful way, which the pain brings you in very close contact with. And I think that has the power to connect us throughout the world and in our communities, especially now that we are pretty much, the world is turning towards understanding that we are in a death grip. It is serious.
Yeah.
And so I think that has a hugely transformative power.
Yes, I think you're right. An interesting example of that, I think, is I mentioned this book, The Future Eaters by Tim Flannery, the mammalianologist. How do you say that?
A mammologist.
A mammologist from Australia wrote this book way back, and he's talking there about the big fires in the 90s outside of on the East Coast, and that nearly burnt down the capital city, and the fact that they hadn't really learned how to embrace the approach to fire control that the Aboriginals had used, which was to have fires, like we did here in California, for eons. And just this year, with the huge fires again, I heard on the radio, NPR had some reports where Aboriginals were talking about maybe now the government's going to listen to us because we've been advocating this for years. We need to do these fires every year. We need to go out and burn because if we don't, we have these conflagrations.
Right.
So, and I'm hoping, having lived through 2 here in Sonoma County, having to leave here last year and the year before, and 2 years ago, leave here because of the fires, and knowing 40 people had their homes burned. Yeah. I mean, it's like, when is Sonoma County going to allow it? Because they're still trying to stop people from doing controlled burns because of the air quality issues. Right. So it's a freaking mess.
It's delaying a much worse fire.
Right. So the pain may change things. Maybe that's what you're talking about, the really concrete examples.
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
Do you see others?
Well, I think, as people can no longer negate the fact that they too are unsafe, there's been so much privilege and shielding, when people have capital and they only think of climate change as something far away with the people who have far less are dealing with, and they kind of allow themselves to stick their heads in the sand about it rather than confront the painful reality that they are perversely allowing people to pay first and hardest for their carbon expensive lifestyles here. As their homes fall into the water, as their communities that they've loved go up in flames, it's becoming ever more obvious each year. It's just the disasters are mounting and mounting. And I think that does there's a reason now why we are talking about the mental health impacts of climate change, why there's articles every day about eco-anxiety. If it's not the adults themselves with the power to change their decisions, it's their children that are coming home and saying, I'm not going to die from a disease. I'm going to die from climate change, or I'm not going to die from old age. These horrific statements are coming to the fore. It's very normative when you talk to young people now. Yeah. They're really afraid. So in that sense, I think it's only a matter of time until there's a more truthful, reckoning for people within their own lives that will also lead to some change.
So let's talk about the new book, because that's what you're talking about right there. When I heard about the new book, I was very interested in that, because my goddaughter, who lives in the cottage behind this house, she just turned 21 this last week, and she's concerned about it. I mean, her generation has a lot of anxiety. I'm on the board of a school, and a level of anxiety among teenagers is huge.
Yeah.
And way beyond what it was in my age. I mean, I'm 62. I didn't have the kind of angst, the same kind of angst. I had angst. I had acne. I was like, but I didn't have the kind of angst that I see now, like real depression.
Yeah.
So what motivated you to do the book and talk about the book, please?
For me, it was turning my attention towards what it would mean to have a child today. Considering that with my partner and, being in my early 30s and just getting ready for that possibly, and being a science journalist, paying attention to every report that comes out and just reckoning with that feeling that, this is much deeper than absorbing facts, and it just starts to become much more, for me, it became much more personal when I started considering what that means as a legacy issue. And because I'm a science storyteller, and this is kind of, anything can become a story for me once it fascinates me and has to do with a binding relationship between science and society, I realized, okay, well, there's probably something more here. Let's check it out. And I did a radio documentary about the phenomenon of millennials being afraid to have kids because of climate change. And at the time, I really didn't know if I was the only one having those thoughts, because it wasn't yet written up in all the publications that it since has been. This was in 2017. And I started, doing some research and realized, a lot of people are actually feeling very isolated with these feelings. They're talking about it within their own homes and partnerships, possibly with their friends, but generally not, finding community to talk about this with. And then slowly more groups started evolving to create places where people could share this. And then it became a journalistic topic. Then celebrities and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and royals and everyone brought it to the mainstream. And now it's just something that there's a ton of think pieces on, and it happened very quickly. But that was an interesting curiosity out of my own kind of personal reasons, but I realized it's just a teeny tiny sliver of a much bigger conversation, which is, what are the psychological impacts of living through a climate crisis, and people feel an incredible amount of what's called ecophobia, which is just feeling helpless in the face of how daunting and large this task is to try and get us out of this mess, right? When it touches absolutely everything about our world, and every decision that we make is essentially bound up in making it worse. So that's a really overwhelming psychological reality for people. There's the rise of eco-anxiety, which is described by the American Psychological Association as the chronic fear of environmental doom. There's ecological grief, which is the distress experienced when you witness ecological losses. Let's say your house burns down, or you're an Inuit person in Labrador and the sea ice that constitutes your identity is literally vanishing before your eyes, or you're just anticipating future loss. It's grieving, it's mourning in a premeditated state. There's solastalgia, which is a word to describe feeling homesick when you're still at home because your home environment has changed so much that it's no longer recognizable.
That's happening here because October used to be the best month of the year in Sonoma County. Now it's the most dangerous.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, I've really experienced that over the last 3 years. I have had that feeling like instead of, oh, wow, my favorite time of year, I'm going to enjoy, I get worried and scared.
Yeah.
Because the fires happen.
Ugh. And how quick is that? That's 3 years, right?
Since 2017, really.
Yes. So, I mean, it's this unprecedented rate. And I love these artists at this place called the Bureau of Linguistic Reality. They call it broken record breaking.
Yes.
The endless barrage of news that things are consistently worse than we thought every year. Right.
Ice is melting faster. Temperatures are higher.
Yeah.
More species dying quicker. Yeah, it's a freaking mess, man.
Yeah, it's a mess. And that's going to do something to us because, our secure relationship to our environments that are vital for our survival are breaking down in ways that we're noticing. So that's going to come up in various distressing ways. And we're now starting to have those conversations in a widespread, shared public way around how to deal with this, how to channel this anxiety in a way so that you don't just fall into inactive forms of fatalism, feel like we're totally screwed, the future is done for, and therefore we should just have a party until the apocalypse comes.
Well, I want to get to that, but I want to share two things. So because this is where I want to end up with what you just brought up, because it has to do with denial too. So let's see, it was last weekend. I was feeling kind of forlorn, and I had been reading a bunch, going back through these books, getting ready for this interview, and reading all these things, and I realized, God, I feel really kind of heavy and sad. And a buddy of mine sent me this link to this beautiful piece of music, and I turned it on, and I just started crying like that. It's just like, I don't know what it was. That's a very unusual thing, man. And I thought, wow, something is going on in the world, like realizing all this stuff and dealing with what's going on. But I wasn't aware of the emotion until, I wasn't aware that it was that big. And then the music just triggered it. And I was like, wow, that is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But I thought, I'll bet there's going to be more and more of this, because of what's happening in the world.
Absolutely. I've had a very similar experience. I never used to cry about something as abstract as an environment, rather than a person or some kind of human drama.
Right.
And that started a couple of years ago for me as well. And I've had episodes over those couple of years where grief and emotion comes and rocks me, and it's very intense, and it has to do with witnessing loss, and it is a form of grief. And I think that will be ramping up, and people are saying that it is ramping up for them. We're feeling this.
So the for many years in my world, the folks, particularly in the farming community, were saying, it's climate change, and the climate's always changing, and all those things that we heard for so long. And I look at those who are still denying, and some are doing it because they produce coal or oil, probably, or fossil fuels, or are part of industries that are part of the problem. But others don't want to. I think they're afraid at some level. So, why don't you talk about that piece you were going to get into there about, what the coping mechanisms are, good and bad, or positive and negative, so to speak.
So the psychologists of climate outline different forms of denial. In our culture, we generally talk about climate deniers being, people who have fossil fuel interests, and there's things bound up in their identity, and they protect it, and they literally negate it. They just say, this is not real. It's a hoax from the Chinese or whatever. But there's a much more common form of denial that we all participate in, and it's called disavowal. And it's basically like having one eye open and one eye closed at the same time. So we believe the science, we're genuinely freaked out. We know that this is an emergency and we want to act. But simultaneously with another part of our brain, we play down the threat in order to live out our lives according to our own desires and hop on the next plane. And this is a form of what they call a perverse state of mind. And essentially we've evolved to have these perverse states of mind because they protect us from anxiety and pain. Basically, what's perverse about it is that it allows us to pretend ourselves away from reality so that it produces this protection regardless of the cost.
So what would that look like? I mean, give me a concrete example of how that would look.
So I do this. For example, I flew to share my research at a conference in Vancouver last week. I know I shouldn't be flying, but I make justifications to go do it.
My friend who's here, we were just talking about that this morning. Like, how much we fly, and are we going to change how we fly?
Exactly. Like, are we really going to give that up?
Right.
It's a way of, because you can get into a place when you really analyze it and you look at the carbon tonnage that's coming out from your personal activity over a year, and you feel a lot of anxiety about it, and it feels terrible. And the ambivalence, the really uncomfortable thing is that cognitive dissonance of seeing that your activities don't line up with your values, right? And so your mind can do something to thwart that, to shut it down and try and produce some protection from the anxiety. And then you kind of turn away. There's endless opportunities we have all the time to stick our head in the sand to some degree, even though we're environmental.
Get on YouTube.
Yeah. There's, and this is understandable. And I think we need to be forgiving of that. We live in a very carbon expensive society, and it's tough to make these decisions and be a perfect saint in our footprint, but it is still downplaying the reality. Do you frivolously, are you going to go on a vacation? Are you going to fly across the globe at some point this year? I mean, a lot of people are. And so that would just be a very basic example. But the problem with these protections is that anxiety and pain, when we really process it, when we give ourselves the space to kind of stretch our window of tolerance to sit with those feelings, we can then understand ourselves better, how we're relating to this better, and identify forms of action that we want to take. So it's actually very important to have a place where we can contain these feelings, whether that be, a friend, a community group, a therapist, and the rise of climate therapists is happening.
Yeah, I was going to say ecopsychology has been going on for a while, but now it's more climate psychology. Is that what it is?
Yeah, there are many climate psychiatrists and climate psychologists now in different continents working to help people face their anxiety, and the overarching aim is to not fall victim to this anxiety, but to find ways to stand in your power and take action, no matter what that might mean. It doesn't necessarily need to be protesting a pipeline or getting out there in the streets. It could be something that really taps into your aliveness, right? And so in that sense, these forms of denial are really important for us to pay attention to, and to try and have our own radar out for looking at the ways that our brains might be split off from each other. Because, the problem is when we're split, when we have one eye open, one eye closed, we're kind of dimmed. Our ability to act is dimmed. We do what feels better. We do what doesn't have pain involved in it, right? We reward ourselves. Right. So giving ourselves the space to really be aware of these patterns and talk about them, and find places where we know we're not being judged for talking about what other people would call, such soft, sappy, eco-emotive conversations, like get over it and just go do something. Actually, these conversations are very important. Why do we fast forward between identifying that we're facing an unprecedented existential crisis and going straight to solutions? Like, what about that whole space in between where we reckon with how tough this is, and that it vibrates through our lives, Well,
it's interesting. It reminds me, one of our early podcasts was with a colleague of mine, African-American woman who does a lot of group work with people to cross the boundaries of race and privilege. And it's a very similar thing, because it's uncomfortable. So people want to jump to solution and just pass over all the feeling, which robs you of the depth that gets you to the compassion and the empathy, which makes for the real relationship building.
100%. That's a very good parallel analogy. And it also comes full circle to what Tom Van Doren was saying about the need for mourning. That process is transformative. If you skip over it, you miss out on the ability to relearn the world and make decisions about how you want to be in the face of what is happening. But it requires not pretending yourself away from what is happening, not being split off, not sitting in disavowal, facing these feelings, stretching your windows of tolerance for that discomfort, and then making your decisions for your next steps.
Which is really, in one way, I mean, I look at the world, probably because of the work that I do, I look at the world as kind of having, since the advent of agriculture, been dominated by a patriarchal system that required a kind of coldness in order to do what it's done to the world. The domination of cultures around the world, the slavery, the genocides, that requires a kind of coldness to be able to do that.
Yeah.
War. You have to be cold in war. You suffer deeply. I know many guys who have been through combat or World War II or Vietnam and those guys, they have to be cold in the moment, but then they pay for it later.
Right.
And we're all paying for it now in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the great awakening that you're talking about that needs to happen my hope is it will come, and that the patriarchy or the dominant system that we've had, that coldness, is going to be warmed up by the climate, and we're going to have to change. Because if we don't, there's probably very little hope for civilization.
I also have huge hope that can happen, and I don't feel like I'm feeding myself some self-conviction pill by saying that. Yeah, I do think that there's a hugely transformative opportunity with all of this, but it does require getting into the emotions, listening to these feelings, learning from them, and also identifying that the violence, the history of this traumatic behavior that has been reaped upon the world and so many peoples is the climate crisis. It is colonization. It is slavery.
Right.
And we can't get through it without looking at that full intersectional violence and trying to make reparations across multiple planes.
Isn't that interesting too? And it is happening. I mean, look, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous people rising.
Yeah.
I mean, there is this amazing thing happening. Agriculture's changing, which is, the Bible, in Genesis, it begins, right, when they leave the garden. And that's when we started agriculture. That book, those stories were born at the same time that agriculture began. And that is a moment in time when humans left the animal world and they separated. And we have been under the illusion that we're separated ever since.
Yeah.
But now we're being forced back in.
Yeah.
Back into the garden in a certain sense.
Yeah. And reconnecting. It's all about reconnecting.
Yeah. Well, I have really appreciated this conversation. It's been deep and interesting, and I've learned a lot, and I'm really grateful we had some time, and thank you.
Me too. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Flipping the table.
Hey, this is Michael. As you know, Flipping the Table is sponsored by Roots of Change. You can keep our program going by making a contribution to Roots of Change through our website, rootsofchange.org.